This is our reality, a new normal. Hello, everyone, and welcome to On the Record. I'm your host, Jerome Sawyer. COVID-19 continues to sweep through our country as a number of confirmed cases and those in quarantine increase drastically. With most confirmed cases having no recent travel history and some new cases directly linked to positive patients, experts say we are now in the surge. Officials are doing all they possibly know how to, but still, tracking COVID-19 has been a daunting task, taking a toll on healthcare and other essential workers. Tonight, we discuss COVID-19, a virus in transit. We aim to shed some light on what happens in the background and, of course, what's next. Don't go anywhere. We'll begin our conversation on the other side of this break. So the project really pays itself.
Correct.
They set up
Not the conference, more the school.
As a journalist, I always have to focus on the facts, and sometimes that means going to investigate for myself. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. right here on RTV.
This is On the Record. I'm your host, Jerome Sawyer. Despite lockdowns, increase in specialized healthcare facilities, and all the efforts made, the death toll and recovered cases seem to be almost evenly matched. With 1 in every 5 confirmed cases identified as healthcare workers, we hope and pray that people are now taking the threat of COVID-19 more seriously. My guest tonight is tasked with ensuring the highest quality of medical care. He's the Deputy Chief Medical Officer. We're very happy to have with us again Dr. Delon Brennen. First of all, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me, sir.
Let's talk about contact tracing and the epidemiology of COVID-19. First of all, big word, what is epidemiology?
So epidemiology is merely tracing the path of what is going on with a particular disease. So you're looking both at where these cases are happening, you're looking at how they're happening, how long from when the person may have been exposed to when they die or when they progress in their disease or develop symptoms. It's really looking at how things progress locally for an individual, but also how does that track over the course of the population over time as well.
How does this help now in trying to mitigate? Because once you figure out how it spreads, how does this help now in trying to stop, slow down, prevent?
I think one of the big things that everyone has come to know as this curve and flattening the curve, that's an epidemiological curve. And so what it means is we can see what's been happening around the world. And if you allow things to just kind of spiral out of control, you get a big peak in the number of cases that you have in a very short period of time. And so knowing that that's what could happen, we know that in order to prevent that, we're going to need to put in public health measures to flatten the curve or make sure that the number of cases that we have, even if you have a large number, that number gets spread out over time rather than having a large surge of them at once that then overwhelms your healthcare system. So knowing that epidemiology, how long it takes for you to get into a high peak, what the measures are that need to be in place in order to mitigate that. We use epidemiology to help us to predict and then put in measures that help us to watch. Are we still having a huge peak, or have our measures that we put in allowed us to stretch that out and then keep it under control, at least for the time period?
From a public perspective, we see the numbers climbing. Every time there is an update, every time we see an increase, every time we see the death toll go up, we get anxious.
We do.
Is that to be expected?
I think the anxiety with it is to be expected. I think for as many of us that have connections with the internet or with television, we can see what's happening around the world. And the fact that for all of us who sit back and say, hey, let's put in these measures, we'd love to have no symptoms or no cases at all in country, but we know that's not going to happen. But what we're able to do is see the difference between whether putting in those measures make a difference or not, and then try to come back to the Bahamian people and say, are these things working? Are they allowing us some time to be able to measure this and mitigate against it, or is it a problem? And I think if people just take the opportunity to look to see what's happening here in the Bahamas, over time. And you're just talking about, we're about 3+ weeks, just shy of 4 weeks from our first case to what's happening now, and look at other countries and other jurisdictions and see what happened with them 3 weeks to 4 weeks in. You'd actually see that our numbers, while are worrisome to us in the healthcare sector because we have to take care of each and every one of those people, especially those who have severe disease, the escalation that's happened in other countries are multiple times what we were seeing within that same time period. So you'll see some countries, yes, they have one case, and then 3 weeks later, they're having 20 cases a day, 50 cases a day, 80, 100 cases a day, where we're still in single digits and sometimes less than 5 cases per day. So our cumulative rate is going up. But when you look at that, how fast it's going up compared to others, I think we could honestly say that we're suppressing how fast we're accumulating severe disease. And while the death rate is worrisome for us, we're not necessarily seeing the high numbers, total numbers of deaths that are being seen in some other jurisdictions.
And it also, you also have to keep into context that we are a small community.
Correct.
And so when you have 5-6 people dead, that seems like a whole lot.
It does.
I want to, before we get to the map, I want to look at the case, for instance, of New Zealand, which has really been in the news lately. I think they have something like 1,200 cases, but just one death. They took some extreme measures from very early on,
correct,
and they seem to be a model. Things seem to be working. Yeah.
I think the thing is, we can model New Zealand. You see similar things like in Germany that has a very low percentage when you think of case fatality rates, or the percentage of people who die. They have a fairly low one as well. Thailand, or you'll see a couple of cases, and following in those models of putting those extreme measures, or what we're seeing at the time as extreme measures in place, has kept them from having those issues. But we also know, if you look at the basic issues that the Bahamas has as a health status, we're also a sicker nation as a whole from the very beginning. Well, and so some of those countries in general are healthier nations than we are. And so when they do have few cases, or even the large number, let's say 1,200 sounds like a lot of people, but in comparison to population, it's pretty small. But when they have those numbers and still few deaths, it's because they were also healthier to begin with. And if we had just a healthier population to start off with, we too would have a much smaller number of deaths as well.
A very interesting point, and something to think about that we all should keep in mind. We need to be a healthier nation. I want to go now to a map that we have created. My graphics team has put together one of the many maps that's been circulated, particularly since yesterday's news conference. Take us through this map, Dr. Brennen, and what are we looking at right now?
Sure. When we first see the map come up, you'll see a red dot, and that represents one case. And this is case number 4. This is actually a healthcare provider. And what we've been able to see is that the cases that are, especially within healthcare providers, tend to have a bigger reach when it comes to contacts. So they come into contact with a lot of people in their own family, in their social networks, but also patients as well.
And those yellow dots,
you see those yellow dots are all of those contacts. And so what we do is then we find out who those contacts are. We get in contact with each one of them, so call them on the phone, or we visit them in person and find out what their individual situation is. Are they having symptoms or not? Because the likelihood is, if people are going to develop symptoms, it's because they were in contact with another case. And so far, in this particular case, it's actually worked out fairly well that those yellow dots haven't then turned into red dots where people are now having symptoms. You'll see the map move a little bit because, again, as a healthcare provider, especially in a nation like ours, their contacts and their patients come from multiple areas. So we actually found a contact of that healthcare provider in Spanish Wells, and so we were able to get in contact with them as well. And things are still going pretty well. But that just shows you in our very small nation that people aren't restricted in their travel to one area. And so when you start mapping things like this, and we've talked about this, internally, we start talking about where people's home addresses are. But as a healthcare provider, you're not providing care in your home. You're providing that care in an office, and most of our healthcare providers work in both the public sector and the private sector. So it makes for a lot of work in the system, but it's true epidemiology and public health at work to be able to find all of these people, make sure that we address their needs, get in contact with them, and they are assured that we are doing the job to follow up with them.
What is very important is if you look at it, it gives you an idea of how that one infection can touch so many people across the island. But one of the things that we learned too is this term of a hotspot. And the eastern side of the island, and I think Dr. Sands put it in context, east of East Street is an area, he described that eastern side as a hotspot. What is the hotspot? And then in that context too, community spread. How do they sort of connect?
Sure, I think what we had to do was get an idea, was look at the map of where our cases are and try to figure out, are there particular areas that we need to be more concerned about? When you look at the map itself, it's actually interesting when we talk about east of East Street being a hotspot. Now that has kind of evolved over time as well. It's like at the beginning of our epidemic in country, we really saw that we had more males than females. That's changed over time as well, and now we have more females than males. So originally we saw more of our cases showing up east part of New Providence, but now those cases have shown up in southern New Providence, in western New Providence, in the central part. It's all over the island now. So, it's great to know these things at the beginning, and you may put in particular measures in one area, but in doing that, things are continuing to spread to others. So it really is an all of Bahamas approach at this point, because we've had a case in Bimini, we have a number of cases in Grand Bahama, here in New Providence, and it's likely that things will show up on other islands as well, so everyone has to be prepared.
Okay. I want to talk about this issue of flattening the curve, so people understand what that means and how do we get to that.
So all of the policies that you see currently being put in place, when people talk about curfews, we talk about lockdowns, just restriction of movement as a whole, a lot of that is this social distancing and making sure people aren't necessarily coming into contact with as many people as they did before. The reason we trace cases and contacts is because it requires one person who's a positive case to pass it on to others. And so these policies are being put in place for the purpose of, quote unquote, flattening the curve. And the curve, again, it really just reiterates the issue of, if you allow people to have as much contact as they would like to have in their usual lives, you will get more people in contact with each other. The virus will pass on from one person to the other quickly, and then you will get a big surge within that first incubation period of 14 days, because so many people got in contact with each other. You're going to get a huge peak of numbers within about 2 weeks. What that means is you could overwhelm your healthcare system because you have too many patients and not enough healthcare providers, healthcare services to be able to address it. What flattening the curve helps us to do is say, okay, keep people apart. You're still going to have some transmission to happen because we still have essential workers moving about. We still have people that are within their homes, within their communities, but you lessen the number of contacts. So if usually on a day you'd come into contact with 20 people, well, now that case may only come into contact with 3 or 4 people. It's still a very efficient transmission, so you may transmit it to half of those people, so you transmit it to 2 people, but that's better than transmitting it to 10 people that you would have usually done so. So that means that right now, those 2 people who become sick are now a very small number of patients that will end up coming into the hospital or coming to our healthcare facilities, as opposed to the 10 people. And that just grows exponentially as those 10 people then touch another 10 people and get it out there. If we minimize that, then it slows down the number of people over time that come in these big peaks. So you want your curve to not just have one big peak, you want it to have a slower rise and a slower decline so that you'll still be able to address all the healthcare needs for all those people who need it.
Honestly, I've got to ask, are there signs of a flattening, or are we still really in this uptick in the surge?
I think we're seeing an uptick when you consider total number of cases over, within the period that we're looking at. But what we're seeing is a flattening in that the number of cases that we're getting on a daily basis, the number of positives that we're able to pick up, is actually fairly steady. So you're not getting one big rush and multiplying that on top of each other. So you're not seeing going from 3 cases a day to 10 to 20 to 40. What's happening is you see 3 cases a day, you may see 6, you see 4, you see 1, you see none. And so what's happening is we're still seeing cases accumulating, but it's not accumulating at a rate where it's multiplying or growing exponentially. And if we continue to these same measures, we'll continue to see small number of cases on a daily basis, which is exactly the way you want this to play out, because you can address the needs of a small number of patients. But when you get all of those, let's say we had all 40 of these patients that we've had so far come into our healthcare system all at once, we would have been overwhelmed and we would have basically shut down the entire Bahamian healthcare system.
Wow, interesting perspective. Stay with us. We are on the record tonight talking with the Deputy Chief Medical Officer. We're going to be back right after this. Welcome to On the Record.
Looking for more On the Record? If you miss our Thursday showing at 8 p.m., join us for the re-airing on Friday mornings at 10, and then again each Sunday night at 8:30. Or go to our YouTube channel and catch up on all of our past episodes. And then like our Facebook and Instagram pages for a preview of upcoming shows and get a chance to ask your questions. Just look for On the Record.
This portion of On the Record brought to you by Executive Printers of the Bahamas Limited. We print profits for you.
Welcome back to On the Record. This segment is brought to you by Executive Printers. While lots may still be unknown of COVID-19, one thing is undeniable. The social landscape of the Bahamas has changed, and we may interact, and it's changed the way we interact. We may never actually go back to what we now know as normal. Who knows? Well, in terms of social distancing, surge and flattening the curve have all been tossed around in the media and press conferences as well as by many experts. My guest tonight is one of those experts. He's here to explain all of these new terms to us. He's the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Delon Brennen. One of the things that I heard yesterday at the news conference was that we could actually see as many as 90 cases by Easter. What would have precipitated that? And that seemed almost frightening when I heard that information.
I think what we've seen is as we continue to accumulate these cases, the idea has always been to keep people from being in close proximity to each other, and that would help to keep us, lower. I think what we have experienced here in country is that has not necessarily always played well in the public. And so people are still finding ways, they're either finding loopholes or they're using reasons that were legitimate reasons for you to get out as an excuse to go and do something. So
I sent the minister a picture of people on Potterski Dock yesterday buying fish, groups of people.
Right, and that was something that was strictly prohibited within the executive order. So when they said, the emergency order says that you're not supposed to have, retail sales of whatever items this is, it would include fish, and it specifically talks about the docks and Arawak Key and the like.
But I only going for my one bag of fish. I mean,
right.
I'm getting people saying, how is that going to hurt? I only going to get this bag of fish. And
every single person doing that exact same thing is what causes the issue, because then people, they start crowding. So we've seen it in grocery stores, we've seen it at pharmacies, we've seen it everywhere. People are still using any reason to get out of the house as an emergency or, as a loophole to say, this is what I'm going to do. And unfortunately, we're still seeing large crowds of people. So the expectation from health side of things is we can't be fooled into believing that just because the emergency order is in place, that people have obeyed that order and that they're not going to pass it on to each other. So we have to be prepared. In a worst case scenario, the expectation is in the next 4 days, we could run into another 50 cases, which would, be more than our cumulative total over the first 3 weeks. But the truth is, if like has happened in some other countries, you see that there could be this accumulation. You have to prepare for that. So we need to make sure all of our healthcare facilities, all their healthcare providers are ready to take that on. Of course, we hope it doesn't happen. And the way it's tracking right now, it may not happen. But the fact is, the data is showing you that worst case scenario, you could more than double the number that you've had already in the next 4 days. And then we would run into an issue with our healthcare.
Are we prepared if that happens?
I think we are prepared we have gotten all of our healthcare providers. We've started shutting down non-essential services. We've informed our medical students, our nursing students, our frontline primary care providers, and told them at this point, a nurse doctor is a nurse doctor. It doesn't matter what your specialty is or was. Right now, we're all COVID-19 healthcare providers. And if you are called on and required to give care in a healthcare setting, whether that's the hospital, a clinic, a revamped modular unit to be able to care for patients, that's going to be our job. And if we don't all pitch in and do our part, we are going to fail as a healthcare system and as a country. And so everyone's job at this point is to take care of COVID-19 patients.
Do you find people are fearful, even though, as a medical student, I can only imagine what that must be like to get that call or to have that conversation?
It is scary. I think no one could have predicted that we would be doing this 3 months ago. But the fact is, we're here now, and this is what we trained for. When it comes to public health, when it comes to healthcare providers, people are talking about, I'm on the front line, I do this. Well, this is what you're called to do. This is really when the rubber hits the road. And at some point, you're either called into this as a profession or you're not. And we have to really, buck what our sensibilities are. And, you see your companion or colleague healthcare providers out there shoulder to shoulder with each other and saying, okay, it's only us. The country doesn't have anybody else to rely on but us. And so we all have to pitch in and we have to do that. And I think once you get past that initial fear and you know that everyone's going to do their job to keep each other healthy. And so if you are wearing PPEs and it's my job to make sure that you get in them properly and you get out of them properly, that's my job. Because tomorrow it may be you making sure that I get into mine properly and get out of it, without infecting myself and then doing other things for other people. And it's not just the individual healthcare provider who is taking care of that patient. It also requires us as a grouping to make sure that the healthcare system as a whole runs as well. So do we have beds? Do we have cleaners in place? Do we have people that answer the phones and give good advice so that people just don't rush into healthcare? We have to be in all places. So when you're answering the phone, it's just as important as that person who is in the facility taking care of someone. So we all have to pitch in multiple places. Do we ever think we'd be using our healthcare providers like trained, physicians to answer phone calls all day, all night? No. But this is what's required in this situation so that we keep people healthy, keep them out of a hospital so they don't get sicker by presenting, and that will help us to deliver better care.
Are we looking after those who are really in the front line, who are on the front line? Are they being tested? For instance, if I'm picking up a patient who we suspect, or if somebody comes in and as a healthcare worker, what are we doing for those people who are physically there having to deal with these suspected cases?
I think there's a number of policies that we put in place. So if you are in a healthcare setting and you get exposed, unbeknownst to you, we find out later there was a case and you were exposed, we are removing those people, and you didn't have on your personal protective equipment. We're removing those people from healthcare and putting them into isolation or quarantine at that point because they don't have symptoms. We're putting them into quarantine and saying, okay, we're monitoring you every day. You check your temperature, you let us know if you have any symptoms, and if they do develop symptoms, then we test them. If they don't develop any symptoms in those 14 days, then we test them at the end of the quarantine period to make sure that they are negative and allowed to then go back into a healthcare setting. Because what we don't want to do is end up with an asymptomatic carrier. So someone who doesn't have symptoms, but they do and are shedding the virus, then going to a healthcare setting and exposing others who may be really at risk of getting severe disease at that point. So we want to test them before they go back in. So we do reserve some of our testing supplies in order to make sure that our healthcare providers are taken care of, because you don't want them to become the proverbial super spreader and giving it to other people. But not only are we testing them and putting them in isolation, some people are doing home isolation. Some people, we have, gone out and done contracts with places where even if you're doing your full personal protective equipment, if you have a fear that, I may take it home to my family, even though I think I'm protected, we have made, a facility available for them to go to where they get somewhere to sleep, they get meals prepared for them, so they don't have to necessarily feel as though I'm going to take something home to my own family, because that's another fear that some people have as well.
I think Dr. Sands would have spoken to it in the House of Assembly. So it is available for people who may feel that they are at risk or just don't want to put their family or loved ones at risk.
Correct.
Okay.
And if they let the supervisors know, then they'll let the Ministry of Health know, and we'll get them into that facility.
Good bit of information. That's a question that was raised to me on a couple of occasions. I'm glad you addressed it. I want to go to now some case studies. Johns Hopkins University, in a review of COVID-19 and the ratio of number of deaths to number of diagnosed around the world, put out these statistics. Some of them obviously may change slightly with the numbers increasing.
Right.
US is at 32%, China at 4%, Spain 9.9%, Italy at 12.6%. Want to bring it a little closer to home now. In the Caribbean, a bit higher, smaller populations though. Barbados and Jamaica 4.7, Trinidad 7.4, but the Bahamas at 16.6%. Does that give us reason to be alarmed?
I think it does and it doesn't, for two different reasons. I think it makes us aware that the fact that we have a sick population to begin with. All the research around the world has told us that when you have people who have number of chronic non-communicable diseases especially, have people who have high blood pressure, heart disease, cancers, chronic respiratory issues like asthma, COPD and emphysema, all of that sets you up for having sicker patients when they do come. And if you look at our data specifically, you'll see that the majority of the patients who unfortunately died in the Bahamas had a number of chronic non-communicable diseases as well, and we had older people within that grouping that died as well. So it's not as though that wasn't predictable given what we have in our population. But at the same time, you hear lots of people going about in these other countries having this wide-scale mass testing system that's going on as well. So they're testing asymptomatic people. So people do this drive-up or drive-through testing. So you may end up finding people who have no symptoms at all, who are diagnosed with the disease, and you're sending them back home to self-isolate anyway, right? So the same thing you wanted to happen anyway is you're telling people, stay home. Do not come out into the public. Remove yourself from being able to pass it on to other people. So what we've done is take if your end result is that you want people to stay home, tell people to stay home, right? If testing them isn't going to make any difference, so me testing you and saying, yes, you're positive, the end result is me telling you to stay home. Me not testing you, the end result is me telling you to stay home. The test isn't what made the difference. Testing isn't this panacea that's going to say, well, now we know that people need to stay home. Nobody in the Bahamas doesn't think that people need to stay home. We already know that. That's what needs to happen. And so we could go about testing lots more people, right? That could happen. But what would then happen is you would run out of testing supplies. And so for people who did become symptomatic, you wouldn't have enough to be able to test those people when they do have symptoms. You wouldn't have enough to be able to test healthcare providers who you're now sending back into the front line who don't have symptoms, but they need to be able to deliver care. So those people who are most going to need the test, you're not going to be able to test them. Along with the fact that a lot of this mass testing that has happened has been based on serologic tests, not on the gold standard of real-time PCR. So these antibody tests that are out there, if you look at the current data and the research around it, says that they are flawed, right? Britain was testing, I think it's 10 different types of antibody tests, and they sent them all back to say, we want refunds on our money because, and they'd ordered millions of them, they sent them all back because the tests are flawed. And these antibody tests are not getting people the numbers that you really want. So they're telling people they're positive, and some of them truly are not positive. when you test them with real-time PCRs or confirmatory tests. Or they end up with a bunch of false negatives. So you're telling people they're negative and they feel as though, hey, I'm safe, I can go out into the public, but those people are false negatives in that they actually do have disease. So you're giving people a false sense of security on one end, you're causing panic on another end using a flawed test. And so we could test a whole bunch more people, find out we have, by the test, a whole bunch more positives, and then we would have a much lower rate of death or a case fatality rate, because you said, I have all these people who have tested positive, but they are well and doing okay. So I explode my numbers of cases to, let's call it 200, but I only have 5 deaths or 6 deaths at this point. So my number comes back down to 3%, much like so many other countries, but that didn't mean anything, because the only thing you were saying was I have healthy people who I want to stay at home, and that's what you're telling your population to do anyway.
Do you accept that the people are anxious over the fact that they could be positive and don't know?
I absolutely understand the issue, right? But will it make a difference in either the care that you're going to get or what our advice to you is from a healthcare perspective? The truth of the matter is it's no on both accounts. So if I tell you you are positive, I still want you to stay home and avoid going out and infecting other people. If I tell you you're negative, I want you to stay home and avoid getting in contact with other people and getting the disease. So either way, regardless of whether I tell you you're positive or negative, I'm going to tell you the exact same piece of advice at the end: stay at home.
Stay at home, and if your symptoms become worse, then you can begin to seek treatment.
Absolutely, because if you then have symptoms, we will then test you, because those are the people that we need to know, because then we're going to make a different approach to their care. Because if you have symptoms and I test you and you're positive, that takes me down a path of what do I need to do with you individually in the healthcare system. Do I need to put you in an isolation facility, a healthcare isolation facility? Do you need to be admitted to the hospital for a different level of care? Do I need to watch you closer because you have these comorbidities and you're likely to deteriorate quickly? That's what I need to know, and it'll change the path I take you on.
Very good point, and I hope people are beginning to understand, because that is a common question.
It is.
And a common complaint, we're not testing enough, and I hope I was able to put at least some things into perspective. And the thing that healthcare professionals say to me all the time, this is a perfect storm in so many ways. What we're doing is trying to manage. It's a good point there. Stay with us. We're going to take another break and come back with more on this discussion right after this. Hello and welcome to On the Record, and a balanced, true and open debate you've been looking for. Welcome back. You are watching On the Record. This segment is brought to you by Global Insurance Agency. While numbers continue to climb through community spread transmission, government and health officials continue to face criticism concerning testing. Some believe they are testing enough, while others question the methods used for declaring a case recovered. My guest tonight is an expert in this area. He's the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Delon Brennen. Delon, I want to talk about some of the deaths, some of them the information we've compiled. Case number 17, a 67-year-old female, New Providence, confirmed on April 1st, no travel history, no direct link to other cases. She died a few days later. When we look at a case like that, that seems almost in isolation, if I can say that. No travel history, no direct link, but passed away. How do you investigate something like that? What kind of conclusions do you draw from a case like that?
I think in the beginning, when you hear that sort of snippet of information, it lets us know that we have more work to do from both perspectives. From an on-the-ground perspective, if we've not been able to establish the link, we need to figure out where it is indeed linked to something, because we know she didn't come up spontaneously with this infection on her own. So we need to figure out what her community links are, what her social issues, or where she would socialize on a normal basis, where does she work, what is her usual path of travel, like what is it that could have been a link to either other known cases or other times, and this is where our scope is even broadening. So we're finding out from our call centers some information from the callers who were calling in to say, hey, I have symptoms. Now, they're not diagnosed cases or anything, but we find out from them where they may work, where they may socialize, where they may go to church, things of that nature, because we may then be able to figure out later that that connection was around a particular, restaurant, right? Let's say, and this is not me saying specific for this case, I'm just talking about in general. If we find out this person works at a restaurant, some other person works at the restaurant, this person frequents this restaurant, they go there for happy hour or whatever, and we find out there were a number of cases around this, knowing where they lived or wouldn't have helped us with that at all, but knowing that this restaurant was a nidus for infection, then that would allow us to be able to say, okay, we know from this, we need to now find out who else works there, who else, and find out kind of the connections in other cases as well. So nothing to us has occurred in isolation. We know we just haven't found what the connection is yet. And so our whole surveillance team, either those who are in contact tracing, those who are in case investigation are out trying to do exactly that. We make multiple phone calls to everyone. So it's not like we say, okay, go home and isolate for that time period and we just leave them alone. No, we have conversations with them each day and we ask additional questions each time. Well, where else do you think you may have gone? Where else are other members of your family? Because again, someone could have been asymptomatic. Where do they work? Where is it that they may have been able to pick it up, bring it home to that person, and then that person was the one that developed severe symptoms, but other people may have been the ones who are actually connected to something.
With so many missing pieces of these very complex puzzles, members of the public are sometimes inclined to believe that health officials are withholding information.
We hear that a lot. I mean, I think we've heard this over and over for other issues as well. So having lived through, being in the Bahamas during dengue, chikungunya, Zika, the scare around Ebola in 2014, 2019, we know that the public sort of has an inherent mistrust when it comes to health officials in believing that we're holding back on information. And I think sometimes, some of us feel as though we're even oversharing at times because we give all these details and this information, but what it does is it feeds the frenzy as well. And people are like, well, what about this? Why aren't you telling me this about the person? Why aren't you telling me where this person worked? Why aren't you telling me about where this person was socializing, where they went to school, where their house is? Because then you end up with this panic related to, like we were sharing, okay, we think the East is a concern, and then it became this discriminatory thing, and I heard it the next day I walked into work.
The same night.
And they were like, oh, those people who live in the East, I knew it was them. It had to be them that were causing the issue. So you feel at times you're given this information and it's taken completely out of context. And so for us, we're trying to share every time we get cases, and people are getting inundated now, and they're like, every time you have a case, are we gonna have to hear about that individual case? But yeah, we release a statement almost every day at this point to say, we've had 3 new cases. When it gets to 3 new cases and you've had, not necessarily in country, but let's say other countries, when they've had 3 new cases in a day, but their total number is 300, people don't care anymore that you've gotten 3 new cases, but we're continuing to push out. If we have 1 case for that day, we push it out. If there's a report, we've heard about a death that's happened that may have had symptoms ahead of time, we release that information. And then people ask, well, were they positive? When's the test coming back? Well, we're still investigating. We're still trying to find out those details, but we're giving information as quickly as we can get it. So I think in this current dispensation of what we do in the Ministry of Health, especially when it comes to COVID, is we're just pouring out as much information. We're making health officials available to do, talks and radio shows and TV shows and, newspaper reporting or whatever. We try to make sure you have as much access. And I don't think there's ever been a time where you've had more access. But
I have to agree with you on that.
So much of the frenzy to go along with it, and people get more worried at times.
Yeah.
Whereas health officials are trying to say, yes, we're giving you just the facts of what's going on, but we're also in the background doing so much additional work in order to make sure that we suppress it.
I really have to just pause for a moment to thank you and to commend you all for the information sharing that we get. I know sometimes I'm even hesitant when I message you or Dr. Sands or others, say, hey, what about this? Or can you confirm this? And understanding that there is so much going on. But you're right, the access that we are getting really is unprecedented. And I just have to say that I appreciate it. Our organization appreciates it. I want to talk, though, about case number 40, a 51-year-old female confirmed posthumously. What happened in that case?
Sure. So it is our understanding once the death actually happened, that when they went back into the history for the patient, they found out that the patient did at some point have fever, did have respiratory symptoms, and when EMS, it sounded as though when EMS picked the person up, they were already having, an oxygen saturation that was really low, labored breathing and the like. So the thought process was, we can't definitively say what they died from, but given that there is a COVID epidemic going on in country, we need to test to see if it's an issue. So the testing actually happened, after she had passed, but we did the testing anyway, and the test came back a couple of days later to say, yes, it was positive. So we have a high suspicion in country around everything. People come in and they're like, hey, I just have headache. And we have to go into the history and say, hey, was this person potentially exposed anywhere? Did you have fever at any time? Asking all these questions related to it.
That must be really daunting as well.
It is extremely. And if for those who visited our healthcare facilities at present, you see a lot of activity even happening on the outside of the facility to say, hey, if people are found, if they come into the facility and they're saying, hey, I have this symptom, we're trying to say, even though you're coming in for, I hurt my leg, are you having anything else that might make us suspicious that it's possible you could also be having issues related to COVID? And if you do, we're going to send you through this pathway where you still get care, but we do it in a way that protects you and everyone else in the facility as well.
Case number 40 died on the 6th, but the announcement was not made until the 9th. That seemed to be an inordinate amount of time. Why did it take so long for us to be notified?
The issue was this is the same posthumously. So the testing wasn't done until after the patient had died. So the patient died one day. The swab was actually obtained the next morning. It had to be flown into New Providence and then have the testing done. So when you have to bring testing in from the Family Islands, and in a situation like this, once we got some history and we said, yes, go ahead and test, it just takes a little bit more time for us to get that particular result.
Just recently, a bit of good news, you would have started to see the recovery rate increase. I think 4 and then eventually 5. I think those are the numbers. I want to talk about how we get to recovery. Explain to me both the test-based strategy and the non-test-based strategy for declaring whether a patient is recovered or not.
Sure. So as you mentioned, there are 2 ways for us to determine, and one is you could either test people. So what happens is if someone was hospitalized or you had a healthcare provider who had symptoms, we go about testing them to say, is this person truly negative for disease? Are they still showing, when you do their nasal swab, that there's virus still circulating in their body, which then means that they can then pass it on to someone else. So when we make sure that the person has finished their complete quarantine or they no longer have symptoms. And once they do, we then test them to say, are they still shedding? So are they now an asymptomatic carrier? If you test them and they're negative, and for healthcare providers, we actually test them twice, because you really, really want to be sure if you're sending a healthcare provider back in, you test them twice, they no longer have symptoms, they are now recovered. For a non-healthcare provider, if they no longer have symptoms, they're at least 7 days out from the last time that they had symptoms, and they had tested positive before, you test them now and they're negative, then that's still the test-based strategy, but they're not going into the healthcare environment. We're still telling them, stay at home, avoid contact with lots of other people, outside of your home or anything. But we know that they are no longer shedding virus. As far as we can tell, that person could stay at home and they should be okay. That's the test-based strategy. So you only need 1 test in that instance for a non-healthcare provider, but healthcare providers get 2. For a non-test-based strategy, basically what we're saying is for someone who, again, is not in healthcare, they only had mild symptoms to begin with, or they may have been a contact, they had no symptoms at all. They were tested at the beginning and you found out that they had symptoms. They were positive, but they've either had no or mild symptoms in the course of their illness. And for the post the 14 days we've told you to stay away, stay in isolation, if you no longer have symptoms for 7 days prior to that, so you have no cough, no fever, nothing that would suggest you could still be having virus shedding, then that person could then be declared as recovered without necessarily doing a test. Because they either had mild or no symptoms to begin with, and the usual course of illness in mild is about 14 days. So when you test them at the end of those 14 days, they no longer are shedding virus. So there's no need to waste a test necessarily on that. You already know that they're 14 days out from when you first did the test. They've had no symptoms for at least 7 days, so that person can then be declared as recovered.
Was that strategy, are you able to say which strategy was used with the 5 recovered?
Sure. There are 2 of the persons that were in the 5 that were a test-based strategy, and there were 3 that were non-test-based strategy.
And people were, I kept getting this question, why aren't we hearing about the recoveries? Why is it taking so long? And I always explain, I'm not a doctor, I can't. But if you can sort of tell us,
Sure.
from the time of the first, as we were alerted to the first case up to now, sort of, is that what we saw with the recoveries, is that generally what happens?
It is. It's a long period. So if I diagnose you on, let's say today, we know we have to wait at least 14 days from that date to say that you have gone through your entire illness period. Even if you were asymptomatic, you've gone through your entire illness period.
But it could be longer.
It could be longer.
Okay.
And so we check with them and say, okay, when we tested you were asymptomatic, during this time period, was there any day where you had fever? Was there any day you had cough? Anything, myalgias as in muscle aches, fatigue, was there anything along the way? And if they say, yes, 3 days ago I had fever, or 3 days ago I had sore throat, right? Then, even though you're 14 days in, we can't count you as recovered because you said that you had some symptoms during that time
Within
period.
those 14 days, there was a symptom.
That starts our new period of counting for at least 7 days. So you only had it that one day, but we have to now wait at least another 7 days before I could say you've been symptom-free for 7 days, and now you get to recover. So you might be 3 weeks out now from when we originally tested you to when we get to recovered. So it can take a long period of time. It is even longer when you consider those people who've been hospitalized. Because if you've been hospitalized, I have to wait for you to finish your hospitalization. And then from the time that you leave hospital, it is unlikely that you have no symptoms at that time. You're just well enough that you're able to go home. Mm-hmm. So now I have to wait till you finish all of your symptoms. And I have to wait, again, at least another 7, and some people are waiting at least another 14 days from the time that you stopped having your symptoms for us to then clearly say that this person who was hospitalized is now recovered. That could be 4 weeks later.
Great explanation. Thank you so much. Our final segment is coming up right after this. The project really pays itself back.
Correct.
They set up
At the conference, the school.
As a journalist, I always have to focus on the facts, and sometimes that means going to investigate for myself. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. right here on RTV.
Thank you for staying with us tonight. This is our final segment of On the Record. Health Minister Dr. Dwayne Sands said during a press conference recently that there are super spreaders in our community. These are people who do not appear sick. They move around and spread the virus to large numbers of people. No one is afraid of them because they do not show symptoms. My guest tonight, Dr. Delon Brennen, Deputy Chief Medical Officer. When he said that in the news conference, I think that for me was such a poignant moment because I thought to myself, how many of them are moving around amongst us and we simply do not know because you appear healthy, you look good, you don't cough, you don't sneeze, you look okay.
Correct.
Okay. We have several online questions. As we try and do every week, we get people to send us questions. Our first question, what happens to the COVID-19 virus after a person dies?
So because it's a virus, it is really sort of a parasite, if we want to think of it that way. It does require a live host for it to be able to have ongoing survival. So it requires the cells, the nutrients within your cells for it to be able to survive. So once the person dies, it's not known exactly how long it lasts within the body, but it is likely that once the cells die, that it is within 12 to 24 hours where the virus would no longer be able to survive. But because the research is still ongoing, we still have to take precautions when it comes to those who die and making sure that we handle those bodies appropriately so that we don't run the risk of potentially finding out later it could survive for a little bit longer and then passing it on.
Which comes to our next online question. What is the process or guidance on the disposal of bodies from COVID-19 positive cases? And how has the government ensured that funeral homes are aware and compliant with these guidelines given the absence of regulations?
So what we have done is look at what's going on around the world for some guidance along this line. And a lot of the countries, if you look at China, who started out with this, is almost universally using cremation as a method to eliminate the possibility of it passing from one person to the other. So that is currently the advice of the health ministry, that people seriously consider using cremation. Now, we can't mandate it. And so we've also had some conversations from a policy level perspective with funeral home directors, and they're just as afraid as anyone else. And when we were dealing with Ebola, which is much more of an issue of its length of time it can last in a body, we had these same sort of conversations. So they were prepared at that time to be able to handle the issues around what would need to happen when it came to handling bodies with Ebola. We think that our conversations with them have also said, this is likely not to be as infectious, but we advise using the same precautions. And so I think they're prepared to use personal protective equipment to be able to handle those bodies and using double bagging and things like that in order to move before there's a possibility of passing it on from the body to a live person.
Another online question, what measures are in place to ensure that those that are at home in quarantine and isolation are following the orders?
So two things happen is we are first in contact with those people from when they're diagnosed to say this is absolutely what needs to happen. And so we continue to call them. We don't necessarily just rely on the fact that we tell you and then 14 days later we check in with you and you've been there. We call continuously at least once a day to check in. Some people get 2 times a day calls. And if we find out that there are people who are violating that rule, so we either can't get in contact with them at all, or we find out through our conversations with them that they're not following those rules, then we actually have, and this has been unfortunate, but we have had to use our peace officers, Royal Bahamas Police Force, Royal Bahamas Defense Force, to reinforce that message with personnel. So whether we go to the home and inform them or we go to the home and collect them to place them in a facility.
It's a very polite way of saying it.
So either way, we enforce
so you
the
can,
law.
I can use the Bahamian term, you could get locked up.
Yes, absolutely. And we have done it. This is
This
is not pretend. We have actually used police officers and an ambulance to go to someone's house and pick them up and take them to a quarantine facility.
If it comes to your attention that they aren't. And what if I know, for instance, that, and I don't want to get into the hysteria of it, but if I know someone is under quarantine and I know for a fact that they aren't, they aren't abiding by it, or they're not, locking themselves away, or they aren't moving around, what should I do? I mean, I have a responsibility now.
Absolutely. We all have a responsibility, and our suggestion would be don't try to, make a citizen's arrest. Call 511, which is the COVID hotline, and let us know about that concern. We will then pass it on from the hotline to our surveillance unit. Our surveillance unit will then do an investigation and then if need be, we'll involve the relevant authorities at that point.
Good to know. So you could get locked up. That's the word there. Thank you very much. Dr. Brennen, thank you again for coming by and spending this time with us and giving us so much valuable information. I can't tell you how important this is. And again, I cannot stress it enough. We thank you and the thousands of healthcare workers who are out there, who are putting their lives on the line every day to try and keep us safe and try and get us through this and continuing to provide that much needed care to those who have been infected. So again, we thank you, we applaud you, we wish you well, we pray for you.
Thank you, sir. I definitely need prayers.
Most definitely, and thank you so very much. And those of you who are out there, before we go, I cannot stress enough. This is your Easter weekend, but we are certainly not in a time where it's business as usual. Stay indoors, keep your social distancing, don't go anywhere. Those of you who are essential workers, continue to do well. We know it's hard work. Thank you. That's going to do it for our show tonight. Special thanks to my guest, Dr. Delon Brennen. Thank you very much to my production and technical teams. And of course, you, our viewers, a very special thank you to you. Remember that during this time of lockdown, to remain at home, practice social distancing, and of course, wear your mask in public. And for those of you that are healthy and able to give blood, let's also remember that there is an urgent need and an urgent call for blood. You never know, the life you save may be your own or someone that you love. Stay tuned to this network and Our News and Our News Bahamas Facebook page for the very latest on COVID-19 and this global pandemic. Be sure and catch us next week, same time, same place, right here on the Record. Good night.